The empire builders, the visions, the scandals, the fortunes. The truth about what was next in the real West.
In a past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred and the ancient ones were as one with it. A time when only the children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires in these places with no boundaries. When the force were as thick as the fur of the winter bear. When a warrior could walk from horizon to horizon on the backs of the buffalo. When the deserts were in bloom and the streams pure as freshly fallen snow. In that time when there were only simple ways, I saw with my heart the conflicts to come. And whether it was to be for good or bad, what was certain was that there would be change.
Transportation on the West Coast in the mid-1800s was a mountainous mess of treacherous wagon trails and fragmented railroad lines. Gold and silver miners working in Nevada were forced to undergo a brutal and sometimes deadly trek over the Sierra Nevada mountains to get supplies from California. Those dangers, combined with a rising need for a transcontinental railroad, made the timing ripe for four men, bold, brave, and rich enough to make a railroad through the West a reality.
They were in the morning of their lives. They were numbered among the adventurous pioneers of the West, and with them enthusiasm took the place of judgment. They embarked upon the desperate undertaking and to its success pledged their fortunes, ventured their lives, and against the combined judgment of the world, triumphed. Creed Hayman, 1888.
This was the era of the robber barons. This was the Gilded Age, when public morality was at an all-time low.
They were embodiments of the age of enterprise. They saw the West as a vast open field, just the way they would have seen the ocean full of fish.
This is emergent, energetic, muscular capitalism. Come West. It's smart, it's ruthless, it fits the tenor of the times perfectly, and the West is the great canvas for you.
Sacramento, California in the 1860s was a city ripe with opportunity and promise. Far away from the storm warnings of the Civil War in the East, a whole new breed of pioneer had come west to chip away for gold and dream of striking it rich in the new frontier. Four such enterprising Yankees had already set up shop in Sacramento, and everything they touched turned to gold.
There are two choices in California. You can be a miner or you can mine the miners. And they go into mining the miners. They become merchants.
Leland Stanford was a local grocer with political ambitions. Charles Crocker owned a highly successful dry goods store, and Collis Huntington and his partner Mark Hopkins ran a hardware store.
These were men who were all from mercantile, in some cases lower class backgrounds, whose dream in life was the accumulation of sufficient wealth to live comfortably.
Fate entered the life of these small merchants in the form of this man, Theodore Judah. Judah had been traveling through Sacramento, relentlessly pitching his plan to build a transcontinental railroad. He was so obsessed with his plan, people called him Crazy Judah.
He was the first man to really believe that you could get a railroad over the Sierras. I think Judah, to him, this was a great vision, that this was something that was, in the history of man, was a great undertaking.
Theodore Judah followed his dream. He drafted the first articles of the Pacific Railroad and headed out looking for financing.
If you want to come to my office some evening, I will talk with you about the railroad. Collis P. Huntington, 1860.
It all began here, in a room over the Huntington and Hopkins hardware store. As Judah spoke passionately about his lifelong dream of building the railroad, Collis Huntington watched him with greenbacks in his eyes. He told Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, and Leland Stanford about Judah's proposition.
Building the railroad was the opportunity to make the money. It wasn't operating it. If they could build it, and build it in a decent time, and continue the government's enthusiasm towards the project, they could end up, by the late 1860s, massively wealthy.
But there were two major obstacles standing in the way. The first was financial, although the building of the railroad would ultimately be subsidized by the U.S. government in the form of low-interest bonds. Those bonds didn't kick in until the backers built 40 miles of track. The second obstacle was even bigger than money. It was the imposing Sierra Nevada mountains.
They were long on enthusiasm and a little short on judgment, that most people that went up and saw where they had to build that railroad just said, forget it.
But the numbers added up even higher than the Sierras. There was a popular notion that a railroad to the Pacific would open up U.S. trade with the fabulous wealth of the Orient. Also, by this time, the Union knew the Civil War was inevitable and would need to support a northern route to California. It all made Judah's offer too tempting to pass up.
They're a tough, seasoned group of young businessmen, and they're risk takers.
I said that although I would carry the survey through, I would not agree to do anything further than that. Collis P. Huntington, 1861.
Stanford, Crocker, Huntington, and Hopkins agreed to give Judah $35,000 to do a survey to determine if it would be possible to build a railroad across the Sierra Nevada mountains.
Having them invest in this company was a little bit like getting mouth-to-mouth resuscitation from an alligator, because they took over, really.
The Big Four were born, and with that investment, the men who would be accused of being everything from robber barons to murderers started their climb to prominence and incredible wealth. But one other important factor would help in their underhanded rise to power.
Stanford was in just the right place to become the receptor of political patronage and political gifts, and before too long, he's governor of the state.
On that day, the first shovelful of earth was turned at Sacramento, and the first railroad that was ever intended to be constructed beyond the line of civilization was commenced. Creed Haymond, 1888.
On January 8, 1863, Governor Leland Stanford initiated the Central Pacific Railroad. Utilizing the money-raising genius of Collis P. Huntington, the political clout of Governor Stanford, the bookkeeping skills of Mark Hopkins, and the construction leadership of Charles Crocker, the railroad was conceived.
Don't you put any money into their schemes, they are bound to come to grief. Nobody in the world could get that road through. San Francisco Merchant, 1863.
The San Francisco papers, where the mining wealth was, laughed and scoffed at them. They thought that what they would do was get this thing started, take in a bunch of suckers, and sell out.
But the Big Four were in it for the long haul. Not only would they reap generous cash subsidies from building the railroad, but huge land grants as well. The problem was building enough track to start cashing in. They came up with a sneaky solution. forming their own construction company and naming Charles Crocker president.
And of course, the contract and finance company in building the railroad ordered most of the hardware through the firm of Hopkins and Huntington, right? Two of the big four. So they really tried to keep the entire thing in their own pocket, basically.
But trouble lay ahead. While the Central Pacific was about to bump into the Sierras, their competition in the east, the Union Pacific, was racing ahead. The great train race was on, and quality work took second place to fast work.
They were built simply to allow the tracks to get across one more obstacle in this great race for subsidies and land.
The government gave the financiers $16,000 for each mile of track built on flat land and $48,000 for each mile in the mountains. So the Big Four decided to enlist the help of the state geologist to help reevaluate where the mountains began.
They don't begin by altitude. In other words, you look at the composition of the ground to define whether you're on hills or mountains. The upshot is that they moved the mountains west. And of course, that sounds like a scandal.
President Lincoln signed off on the geologist report. The Big Four were now receiving the $48,000 mountain subsidy for laying tracks on pancake flat land. Theodore Judah was tired of the Big Four's sloppy workmanship and shady business practices.
They may hold the reins for a while, but they will rue the day they ever embarked in the Pacific Railroad. Theodore Judah, 1863.
In November of 1863, Theodore Judah set sail for the east, with hopes of buying out Stanford, Crocker, Huntington, and Hopkins and putting them out of the railroad business forever. He had plans to meet with new financiers in New York, but once again, fate interceded.
So he sails off to New York. He's bitten by the wrong mosquito in Panama, and he dies of yellow fever in New York City.
4 months short of his 38th birthday, the idealist who envisioned the railroad was dead. Now it was up to four realists to undertake the biggest technical challenge of the 19th century.
The work will go on from this side. There will be no delay, no halting, no uncertainty in its continued progress. Leland Stanford, 1863.
After 6 grueling years of building, the town of Promontory Summit, Utah was chosen as the spot where the Union and Central Pacific Railroads would join tracks and join the country in rail and spirit. It would be a day that would forever change the nation and the lives of the Big Four.
Symbolically, I can think of no other event that held more portentous consequences for the future of the American West than that one.
We now return to Empire Builders.
The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad was more than the most stunning engineering feat in America's history. It signified the beginning of a new way of doing business in the West, pioneered by an intriguing new breed of businessmen known as the Big Four. A young America celebrated the joining of the rails at Promontory and shared a fascination with the colorful, clever, and rich men responsible for connecting the nation. And none of the Big Four was more colorful or boisterous than Charlie Crocker.
I never had a nursery period. It was my habit to work day and night. Charles Crocker.
Charles Crocker was born on September 16, 1822 in Troy, New York. He was enterprising from the beginning. He quit school at age 12 and borrowed $200 to go into the local newspaper business. With his earnings, he supported his mother and sister.
Crocker fairly quickly on becomes the genius in the 1860s regarding railroad construction.
While Stanford, Huntington, and Hopkins had been content building the railroad from behind a desk, Charles Crocker took a hands-on approach to laying the rails. One of his first challenges was a giant labor problem. With most of the good workers tooling away in the mines looking for gold and silver, desperate measures were needed.
Charles Crocker decided that maybe a good solution would be to hire Chinese who were beginning to immigrate.
Anti-immigrant sentiment was high, and although many objected, Crocker insisted that the Chinese would make industrious laborers.
As Charlie Crocker once snorted, he said, "Hey, any race that can build the Great Wall of China can build a railroad." And he was entirely correct.
This argument prevailed, and no more trouble was experienced during the building of this road. Mark Hopkins, 1864.
Remember, the building of the Transcontinental is essentially a race between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Whoever builds the most miles gets the most money.
By the time both railroads were racing toward the finish at Promontory, there was a feeling of jubilation in the air. The Central Pacific had already cleared the Sierra Mountains, so Union Pacific Vice President Thomas Durant thought he'd have a little fun with Charlie Crocker.
He made a bad mistake. He wired Charlie Crocker, and he said, "My people today put down 7 3/4 miles of rail. It is a record that will stand forever. Or do you think you can beat it?"
Charlie Crocker bet Thomas Durant $10,000 that he could beat the Union Pacific's track-laying record.
It was in April of 1869. The tracks progressed at the speed of a walking man throughout the entire day. So cocky was Charlie Crocker that he ordered a halt for lunch, a full 1 hour off in the midday. 7 o'clock in the evening, declared sunset time, and they found that they had laid a record which still holds today, 10 miles and 200 feet and a few inches.
Charlie Crocker had the last lap, and with his tireless leadership and the relentless Chinese raced to Promontory. But on that day of glory, Crocker didn't show up.
It wasn't because of disappointment. Crocker later said he was simply so exhausted he wanted to go home and sleep a decent night's sleep for the first time in years, which is exactly what he did.
After building the railroad, Crocker built himself a huge mansion on San Francisco's prestigious Nob Hill. And after he decided to enlarge his garden and his neighbor refused to sell Crocker his land, Charlie Crocker proved to be as ruthless in house building as he was in railroad building.
And he wouldn't sell it. So Charlie Crocker built a fence that was legendary, 30 feet high, right up to the property line, so the guy couldn't get light, air, or see anything. Charles Crocker could get real rough.
As flamboyant and boisterous as Charles Crocker was, Mark Hopkins was just the opposite, quiet and introverted.
He was called Uncle Mark. He was the oldest of the group, perhaps the most set in his ways. He was the accountant, the bean counter.
Hopkins was the anchor of the group, but for a man of such reserve, he wielded a lot of power.
He's Silent Sam. And when the others all fight, they all look at him, and Mark Hopkins leans back, puts his hands together, closes his eyes, and tells them what to do, and they all do it.
From his early days as a country shopkeeper in Lockport, New York, Hopkins left the flash to others. He married his shy cousin, Mary Sherwood, and the couple adopted Timothy, the son of a family that had died crossing the plains. Even while the railroad was being built and money was pouring in, Uncle Mark was still living in his modest Sacramento home like a small-time shopkeeper.
He saw no reason until his wife objected to having to do her own housework, considering the amount of money they had, and then he finally decided he would build something on Nob Hill with the other millionaires, and before the house was completed, he died.
Hopkins had been the eldest of the group, the quietest and the most genuinely loved. But after his death in 1878, Hopkins managed to attract the kind of controversy he was so good at avoiding in his life. The trouble started when his wife, Mary Hopkins, started to come out of her shell.
Ironically, this is the woman who behaved just like she should have been the multimillionaire nouveau riche. Her life was scandalous.
Shortly after her husband's death, Mary Hopkins married a much younger man by the name of Edward Searles, the man who helped design her extravagant Nob Hill mansion. Timothy Hopkins didn't approve of the match one bit, and before long the three ended up in court, fighting over Mark Hopkins' estimated $20 million fortune.
There's a morbid fascination about this whole thing, and there's also a sense of awe and perhaps disgust.
The annex of Mary Hopkins and the highly publicized trial gave the world its first glimpse at the incredible kind of money that the Big Four had made from the railroad.
I think it triggered an outpouring of public resentment, which had existed before, but which had been bottled up.
The tide was indeed turning for the popularity of the Big Four. And as extravagant as Crocker and Hopkins were, they didn't hold a candle to the incredible wealth amassed and flashed by the other two of the Big Four, Collis P. Huntington and Leland Stanford.
Everyone believed they were being gouged, and the partners argued that they had this tremendous debt they had to pay. In the meantime, the millions rolled in.
We now return to empire builders.
If it rained $20 gold pieces, there'd still be people begging for their suppers. Leland Stanford, 1885.
Of the four, perhaps the closest to be born with any advantage was Leland Stanford.
Leland Stanford was born on March 9, 1824 in the upstate New York town of Watervliet. He wasn't an exceptional student, but he struggled his way through law school.
He's the kind of person who could take his dullness and transform it into an asset. In other words, he was so ponderous, people thought he was wise, but he wasn't.
Unlike Hopkins, Huntington, and Crocker, who seemed to relish hard work, Stanford seemed to prefer the leisure activities that came along with being a millionaire. While the others were counting their cash, Leland Stanford was busy spending his.
Leland Stanford was more of a dilettante than a serious investor. I mean, he tried to open a vineyard and he raised high-priced horses. These are the hobbies of a very wealthy man.
These are men who make a massive amount of money very quickly and are not particularly shy about showing it.
But there was something money couldn't buy, an heir. Leland Stanford and his wife Jane had been trying desperately to have a child, but their efforts were in vain. Until May of 1868. Suddenly the Stanford's dream came true. Unexpectedly, Jane Stanford was expecting.
Perhaps long after they had given up the idea of having a child, they had Leland Jr., who becomes the focus of their lives. He becomes their spiritual anchor. He becomes their emotional focus. He's a child who is given every advantage. He's given the best tutors. He's taken to Europe. He is, by every account, also a precocious child.
Leland Stanford Jr. showed remarkable promise. But in 1883, tragedy struck the Stanfords. 17-year-old Leland Jr. fell ill with typhoid fever.
He dies tragically. Tragically for his parents, because he was the vessel that they had invested so much in their lives.
How do you create a memorial for this child? And their answer, since their son did have intellectual interest, was to create a university in his name. And it is Leland Stanford Jr. University.
In October of 1891, the gates of the Stanford's Palo Alto farm opened in an educational tribute to their late son. Stanford University was born.
Stanford's waning years are essentially devoted to creating this monument in the form of Stanford University for the memory of their son.
Young man, you can't follow me through life by the quarters I've dropped. Collis Potter Huntington.
Collis Huntington was once alleged to steal anything that wasn't nailed down. And the definition of what wasn't nailed down was anything he couldn't pry up.
By the time Collis P. Huntington grew to age 14 in his hometown of Oneonta, New York, he had already worked and saved $100. Huntington would spend the rest of his life building on that savings. He didn't want the glory, he wanted the cash.
He had the pragmatism of a Yankee. He had the business acumen that anyone in the 19th century would have envied.
Huntington worked as a purchasing agent for the Big Four on the East Coast, struggling to get the materials necessary to keep the tracks moving. He became known as the Great Persuader, cutting the best deals on everything from shovels to blasting powder. No small feat during the Civil War.
Huntington does not brook much nonsense from those he thinks do not have the vision he has. And the vision he has is that he is the greatest businessman and patron of the state of California.
One of the people Huntington felt didn't share his intellect was Leland Stanford.
They'd been trusting partners in the business, but they never really liked each other. And Huntington made no secret of this.
With Huntington buying goods and swaying Congress in the East, and Stanford handling the politics in the West, hostilities between the two stayed in check. But that all changed when Stanford decided he wanted a new political position.
He ultimately upset C.P. Huntington by proposing himself as United States Senator. And he was made United States Senator from California, which antagonized Huntington terribly, felt that Stanford was not the person for the job, and who was seen by Huntington and perhaps others as the ultimate exercise of Stanford's ego.
The railroad had already decided to back a man named Sargent as their representative in the Senate. But Stanford pulled a power play and forever alienated Collis Huntington.
Stanford squeezed Sargent out. This inflamed C.P. Huntington, and in retaliation, Huntington arranged that Stanford be deposed as president of the Southern Pacific.
He wasn't a particularly effective senator, and maybe that was in part because he had a massive investment in a corporate entity out here to keep an eye on as well.
Although they were now adversaries, Huntington did have one big thing in common with Stanford: no children to follow in his footsteps. So he began to look to his sister's son, Henry.
C.P. Huntington's heir apparent. He's a nephew. He's seen as trustworthy. He's seen as sharp, as smart, as intelligent as C.P. Huntington himself is.
But was there a son or an heir? After Collis Huntington's wife died in 1884, he remarried a woman named Arabella, a woman with a mysterious past. Arabella had a son who bore a remarkable resemblance to Collis himself, and an ex-husband who was nowhere to be found.
He's a mystery man. When this child grows up, and his name is Archer, he bears remarkable similarity to Collis Huntington, and Collis adopts him. And today, most scholars will say that it's Collis Huntington's illegitimate child whom he has legitimated.
The Big Four's personal lives were scandalous, and so were their business dealings. The Central Pacific became part of the huge Southern Pacific Railroad Company, and by 1900, the Big Four owned rails from Oregon to Texas. Their monopolistic grip would continue to squeeze the West until it all exploded in violence.
We now return to empire builders.
The West had never known men of such incredible wealth and power as the Big Four. And with the average Californian growing more and more frustrated by expensive fares, frequent train crashes, and bad service, it was only a matter of time before public hostility would come crashing down on the railroad barons.
Leland, Stanford and Company have bamboozled the government and the people out of a stupendously magnificent franchise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Placer County Circular, 1864.
They began to reinforce the prejudices people had about railroad barons and tycoons in general.
Once the novelty of the transcontinental railroads began to fade, the resentment toward the Big Four began to grow.
These are guys who took on a monstrously ambitious task and succeeded. Now, if you expected the railroad to bring universal wealth and prosperity to the state of California in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, it didn't happen.
The Big Four had power over more than just the railroads. By controlling the only method of transportation, they had leverage over virtually everybody.
You have to understand that the railroad was very shrewd. If it wanted to go through a part of the country, it had a choice of going through a town or going around it. If it bypassed the town was dead. So they would go to the merchants and the leaders in the town and they'd say, buy our bonds, or we go around you. And you had to better buy the bonds.
You could hate the railroad for all sorts of reasons, because they put a train down your street. You could hate them because they killed your livestock. You could hate them because they killed your paperboy who stepped in front of the tracks. You could hate them because they charged too much money for your travel from point A to point B. You could hate them because you were jealous. You could hate them because they imported Chinese workers. They definitely wielded power. They sit atop the largest landowner, the largest employer, and the largest transportation entity in the entire state. That's power.
Many felt they abused that power, especially in an episode that would come to epitomize the violent, ruthless, iron fist rule of the Big Four, the battle at Muscle Slough in 1880.
Crocker, Huntington, Hopkins, and Stanford. The public image is the octopus. Those who sat astride the vehicles of trade and commerce and squeezed.
240 miles south of the Big Four's mansions on Nob Hill, in an undeveloped area in the San Joaquin Valley known as Muscle Slough, the Big Four were building yet another railroad. In order to populate the area, they enticed farmers with the promise of selling them inexpensive land on a deferred basis.
The farmers themselves saw themselves as having binding deals at certain levels, certain rates with the railroad, which the railroad was obligated to support.
The farmers toiled the soil in Muscle Slough for years, fighting off starvation and drought, until the land became fertile and they finally saw their hard labor begin to pay off. That was when the Big Four decided they wanted to be paid off too.
The railroad is ripping these guys off. The railroad is coming and essentially saying to them, you now have to pay for the improvements you've put into the land with your own sweat and blood.
The sale price of the now fertile land suddenly jumped from the $2.50 per acre figure the farmers had been enticed by. The Big Four now determined the land was worth as much as $40 per acre.
And it ultimately resulted tragically in armed conflict, where the railroad and the railroad land agent enlisted the aid of the local sheriff to essentially dispossess squatters. That was the railroad's view.
The dispute had to do with what the land was worth, whether or not the railroad had real title to it, and could then force settlers to pay the railroad's cost for the land.
The settlers couldn't afford the land that they had come to think of as their own. They organized a settlers' league and appealed to the Big Four. A case was filed in federal court. Outmatched by the railroad's lawyers, the settlers lost. They were told to leave, but they weren't budging.
There's some incident that provokes gunplay. The horse rears up, and one of these men is knocked into the street. At that point, these guys reach for their weapons, and when the smoke clears, several of them are dead.
5 farmers and 2 federal marshals died that day. The remaining farmers and their families were ordered to leave Muscle Slough. That bloody episode at Muscle Slough would tarnish the reputation of the Big Four permanently, when the gunfight was turned into legend by a novel called The Octopus.
It's not just that it's multi-tentacled, it's a monster, and the fear is that it's everywhere. Huntington in particular comes in for most of the venom from the cartoonists, probably because he lives the longest and he's the most ruthless. Hunchback, miserly, often shown engaged in acts of violence and cruelty against animals or against the people of the state of California.
Muscle Slough wasn't an isolated incident. In Oakland, there had been riots and death when the Big Four tried to monopolize the ferry boat business there. And by 1894, when railway workers at the Pullman Company organized a strike, the public had had enough. That strike also turned violent when 4 federal troops were killed outside of Sacramento. Hatred toward the Big Four continued to grow. The Big Four had already lost the popularity contest, and they were beginning to lose their iron grip as well. The growing Southern California community of Los Angeles needed a harbor. A local group of businessmen there wanted the harbor to be dug out in the city of San Pedro. But the Big Four had already laid tracks in Santa Monica.
What develops fairly quickly is a battle between the Southern Pacific, who want to put the harbor in Santa Monica. It takes about 10 years, and eventually the Southern Pacific loses.
Although the Southern Pacific still made huge profits from Los Angeles harbor traffic, it signaled their first major defeat and a blow to Collis Huntington's stature.
They don't like to lose. Collis Huntington makes a real tough play for the harbor in Santa Monica, which of course would change the whole tourist trade in California.
The power of the Big Four had indeed slipped, but it hadn't fallen.
We now return to empire builders.
They did believe to the day of their deaths that they had built something important and durable in California, a railroad network without which the state would not have achieved the form that we take for granted today.
While Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Leland Stanford, the remaining three of the Big Four, had grown to be the most hated men in California, not everything they did fit the actions of ruthless robber barons.
I don't think anyone could ever characterize them as being entirely altruistic, but at the same time, I don't think they're nearly as selfish and bad as some people would have them believe.
Beyond the scandals and ruthlessness, the Big Four left many positive legacies, nearly as important as the railroad itself. As tough as they were, they showed incredible compassion toward minorities.
It's also important to remember that these men had a level of idealism that's often overlooked. They were, each and every one of them, committed abolitionists.
Huntington, quite secretly, but I think when called on it would admit it, is a rather startling example of 19th century big business support of African Americans.
Charlie Crocker's willingness to use Chinese railroad workers was also radically tolerant for its day. 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce was Chinese, and the railroad brought in as many as 15,000 immigrants from China to work on the rails. But even more revolutionary than his recruitment of the Chinese was Charlie Crocker's dealings with the Indians.
He turned out to be just a genius on handling people, and among other things, in handling Indians. He made a treaty with them while the Union Pacific had constant, terrible problems with Indians. They had to have army troops with them and everything.
Crocker actually turned down an offer from the government of federal troops to help deal with potential problems from the Nevada Indians. Instead, Crocker decided to deal peacefully with them.
He made an agreement with the chiefs in Nevada that they would have free transportation on the train as long as they would not hurt the train crews. They made a peace that stood for at least 28 years or longer. They never had a single person killed by Indians, and they always honored their agreement with the Indians, which was to give them free travel.
Unlike the bloody battles which had plagued the Union Pacific, not one skirmish interrupted the progress of the building of the Central Pacific. And had one erupted, the Big Four were ready.
The Southern Pacific Railroad operated the first hospital for its employees in the United States. Now, this is revolutionary. They're running their own corporate hospital, not because they love their employees, but because they want to keep a healthy workforce, because they want people to be able to show up to work.
In addition to their often surprisingly liberal politics, the Big Four became increasingly interested in the arts and sciences. It was Leland Stanford's love of racehorses which resulted in a giant invention.
Modern motion pictures owe a fair amount of historical debt to Leland Stanford. There is a bet he had about whether or not a horse has all four legs off the ground when it runs, prompted him to invite photographer Edward Muybridge to his Stanford farm. And Muybridge created what are an early version of motion pictures.
He sets up batteries of cameras set a foot or two apart with strings or wires across the area where the horse will run. These wires are tripped or these strings are broken, the shutters are released, and he's able to create a form of motion picture.
Motion picture photography, the railroad, racial tolerance, a health plan, Stanford University, museums, and art galleries. These are some of the surprising legacies of the Big Four.
His name is glory to the state, and his life is the brightest page in her history. Hail, all hail, Leland Stanford. Stanford Admirer, 1863.
On June 21st, 1893, Leland Stanford died suddenly of paralysis of the heart. It was tragic news for Jane Stanford, and even worse news for the newly founded Stanford University, because it meant a bitter old Collis Huntington was now in control of the purse strings.
They were pouring money into the project when Stanford died, and that's when Collis Huntington got even, because he literally cut off the money supply to Mrs. Stanford.
I could lay down my life for the university. Every dollar I can rightly call mine is sacred, laid on the altar of my love for the university, and this it shall ever be. Jane Stanford.
Jane Stanford amazed everyone. She scrimped and saved and deeded her San Francisco home to the university. The university became her life.
Mrs. Stanford ultimately peddles her jewels to build this place of higher education, this place that they thought that their young son would grow up to represent.
Even though Huntington had alienated Jane Stanford, she refused to take the hostility between she and her husband's partner to the grave. She called a surprise meeting with the miserly Huntington.
Collis Huntington was stunned. She came in and she said, "We've been fighting long enough. Let's make peace. I forgive you," and left. Collis Huntington didn't know what to say. He was totally nonplussed. In a sense, she trumped his ace.
Charles Crocker was seriously injured when he was thrown from his carriage in New York City in 1886. He never fully recovered from that injury. He died on August 14, 1888.
They never believed that they were going to make the kind of money that they made. Charlie Crocker dies, his estate's $28 million. And it's a straight-on growth until Henry Huntington dies, and the estimates there are around $70 to $80 million.
On August 13, 1900, Collis P. Huntington became the last of the Big Four to die. He controlled more railroad than any man had ever controlled before.
Huntington dies a rich old man. He transfers a great deal of his wealth to his widow, Arabella.
After Collis is dead for 13 years, she marries his nephew, Henry. And so bringing together the fortune that was divided by Collis Huntington's will.
You couldn't open a newspaper in California throughout those years of their lives without reading something about them.
The legacy of the Big Four was as contradictory as the men themselves. Merchants who transformed the Old West and left a blueprint for American big business that was sometimes brutal, but ultimately glorious.
Only together could they have done it. Huntington was the purchasing agent. Hopkins kept the books. Leland Stanford was governor of the state of California negotiating the politics of this. And Charlie Crocker was out physically building the line. But if you took one of the Big Four out, it wouldn't have worked.
By the time of Collis Huntington's death in 1900, it was a different West than the one in which the Big Four had made their fortunes. The government had started to break up the iron fist monopoly the railroad barons had enjoyed throughout their entire lives. But even more important was an invention that would forever end the incredibly powerful transportation monopoly of the railroad, the coming of the automobile.
This was one way to force Japan to surrender. The other way was X-Day. It would have been the biggest invasion in military history.
There would have been 1 million American deaths.
X-Day, the invasion of Japan, tonight at 8 on the History Channel.